Mhm. The beginning. Greetings, students. I hope that you are doing well. It is time for yet another video lecture, and tonight we're going to be spending some time looking at understanding how to work with the family. So, for those of you who will go on to do work with families and individuals, this is a very important part of your learning in terms of really understanding what the family is, how it works, and how you then, as a social worker, needs to go about your job in terms of working with the family. So bear with me as we walk through these particular slides. I'll provide some examples and go into some depth about some of the concepts that will be explored. All right, so first off, we need to understand that as long as there have been people on the planet, there have been families. So we are a societal system. And family structures actually look really, really different depending on where you are, how you grew up. So they often consist of relationships and patterns of interactions with people by blood, as well as they also have situations where there are people who are involved in families who are not actually blood related. And there are infinite configurations. So families look very, very different depending on where you are. And to give you an example, growing up in Mississippi with my mom, dad, my aunt lived with us, who was actually our nanny, and there were 6 kids, in our family until my little sister came along. But in the neighborhood that we lived in, there was a family called the Harris family, and Mrs. Harris was a single mom, and she had 2 teenage sons. And for literally as long as I can remember, we spent incredible amounts of time together each and every day. So they were considered family. They actually lived across the street, but they would come to our house because they couldn't afford a television, and so they would watch TV in our family room with our family every night until time for the news. So during that particular time, our relationship bond, my dad took on a different role with those teenage boys in terms of being a mentor. Um, and Mrs. Gurley, their mom, was like a second aunt to all of us. And so when we have family gatherings or when there are tragedies in the families, we respond as though we were actually blood related. So that's just one example of what a family structure can look like that could be very different, and not defined by those classic roles of mom and dad and kids. The primary role of the family is to actually launch the offspring. Sounds really scientific, but it's really, really true. And so your job is from the moment that you're bringing these little people home from the hospital and into your lives, is you're preparing them to live on their own. Um, Once again, you can never spend too much time looking at the generalist practice implementation model. So again, as we do, as generalist social workers, we have to first engage with the families that we're working with, be able to do an assessment to gather the information about the things that are happening from their perspective in terms of what's wrong, looking at how we then start to create and develop a plan with them about how to make things better, the implementation of that plan, the evaluation of that plan to make sure that things are working the way they need to, and then terminating our relationship once our work has actually been done. So now when we're looking at doing family assessments, we have to really understand some dynamics around family communication. And so family communication happens in a couple of different ways. And so there's the verbal pieces. So there are the things in terms of what we pay attention to as people are talking, as well as the nonverbal communication in terms of what people are not saying. So, for example, if I'm doing a family session and I've got a family where there's some discord, and let's say there are 3 kids and the identified problem child is the 13-year-old who's acting out and getting into trouble at school. As people are talking, it's about identifying and looking at who is talking, what they're saying, who is the target of what it is they're saying, who's quiet as it relates to that, who aligns with the other kids that are in the room. Where do the parents stand on it? Are they in the same boat in terms of how they view the issue, or are they in separate camps as well, co-aligning with the kids? So it's looking at all of those particular forms of communication. Who speaks and who responds? Who speaks first? Who speaks the loudest? Who is in agreement? Who is in opposition? All of those verbal pieces in terms of your assessment gives you a lot of information about what might be happening in that particular family, as well as the nonverbals. So if people are eerily quiet and no one talks, then what does that actually mean? And really trying to explore what that silence is about becomes a way to start to look at the family assessment. When we start to look at the family structure, then we start to look at things like boundaries, roles, and subsystems. So families have their own unique boundaries. These are situations that are set up by which the family dictates who gets to be a part of that particular family, what they do, what the rules are, what roles are in the families, what does the dad do, what does the mom do, what do the siblings do, and as well as subsystems. So inside of this family structure system, you've got the system of kids who align with each other, or kids who have relationships, differing relationships with their parents. These are things just to kind of think about when you're looking at those particular structures. And then what are some of the norms? What are some of the unspoken rules? What are some of the expectations that people just know by being a part of that particular family? Um, for example, as a kid growing up in the South, as I kind of indicated before, there was this notion in African American culture that you have to respect your elders. It was just kind of a non negotiable. And there were ways of communicating inside of that family. So, for example, my grandma or my aunt could give me a look when I was doing something that I shouldn't have been doing. And in a glance, without saying a word, without batting an eye, I knew exactly what she meant. Like, you need to stop, you need to sit down, or you're going to be in really big trouble. And she could do that in the course of a couple of seconds by giving me a glance and never having to utter a word. But again, it's around communications in terms of how families connect. So the things that you need to keep in mind also when you're looking at working with families is what we call life cycle adjustments. So families go through these particular cycles. Two people get married, they're a young couple, they don't have any kids yet, now they have kids. And so the focus in terms of the relationships and responsibilities start to shift. The kids grow older, they become adolescents, then we have to worry about them going often being launched to be on their own. We then have middle age, parents are out of the home, and then we have this aging inevitability of death. So as parents kind of go old, so these are all the cycles or the different places where adjustments actually happen and sometimes create issues in families and how they function. So being aware of these, and you'll learn a lot more about this in human behavior, social environment. These are the things that we need to pay attention to when we are assessing where families are actually at. Um, that family assessment needs to also be comprehensive. It needs to look at the social environment. So not only do we need to look at the folks who constitute the immediate family, but what are the resources? Do people have friends? Do they have outside connections? Are there other safe adults that kids can connect with? How does work play a role in terms of this particular assessment, as well as institutions and educational systems? So all of these are part of things that we need to look at when we're looking at the family system. Because again, if we look at it from systems theory, we're looking at a meso approach. We're really looking at what's happening within the family, with the individuals, as well as when they are actually in the community, and the impact that those particular relationships have as well. Now, here is a really handsome and nice looking family. And I decided to put them in the slide presentation because I want to kind of share a couple of things to kind of make you think about it. So this is my family. Obviously, they're me in the middle. To my right is my oldest son, Corey. To my left is my middle son in the green elf outfit, who is Roger, who's my middle son, and then Richard Jr., who's sitting on the couch behind us. So those are all of the men in the family. On the couch, sitting to my far left, is my daughter, who's wearing blue, my wife, Linda, who is in the middle, and then Linda's little sister, who has been living with us now for about the past 10 or 11 years or so. Now, typical, ordinary looking family, right? And so when we start to look at this particular family, there's some things we need to be aware of as well. So when we start to think about subsystems, so groups of people who connect and have their own individual relationships, all of the boys create a subsystem. With Roderick and with his brother Corey being the oldest, they are the oldest subsystem. So they have a relationship that's unique specifically to them because they've been with each other the longest. And so how they interact may look different than how they interact with their other siblings. Richard Jr. and Lauren are about, well, actually, Corey and Rod are about 8 years apart, and Richard Jr. and Lauren are only about 3 years apart. So they're the younger kids. And so they have a unique relationship that's all their own. When they were kids, they hung together so much. They had their own unique language. Actually, they got along so well, they were kind of annoying. But that was their relationship in terms of that. And then the mom, Linda, and I, of course, are the parental unit. So our job is to make sure that kids are cared for, order is restored, discipline is maintained, resources are provided, those kind of things, with a plan to launch the family. And then Lauren and her mom have a very unique relationship because they are the two females. And so they have a relationship that's unique to them, as well as my wife has an individual and unique relationship with all of her kids, separate to that. And then we also have her sister, who is developmentally delayed, who has been living with us, who is in need of pretty much constant 24-hour care. So when we start to look at this dynamic, um, when there are issues that come about in the family and how they function, then the behaviors of one particular individual can actually have an impact throughout the entire family. So I'll give you an example. One of my kids, my boys, was diagnosed with dysthymia, which is a low level, low grade, chronic, continual depression. So his affect was always a little bit different. And so, how we ended up having to maneuver and work with him around particular issues, we had to take into consideration his illness. But that also then had a ripple effect on the other members of the families in terms of the differential treatment that he received from us, not in a good or bad way, but just a different way based on what that particular child needs. So when you think about, and then, the wife has this symbiotic or has this subset relationship with her sister, which has been a relationship that's probably the oldest in the room. And then my wife and I have had a fairly significant relationship as we've been married for 30 plus years. So when you think about the family, and so as issues arise and behaviors are demonstrated in one particular individual, it does have a ripple effect across the family. Sometimes there might be dynamics that happen within the context of the family that actually are generating some of that behavior. But a good family assessment person or social worker such as yourself will start to do some exploration with the family about how they're functioning and what kind of things are going on with them. When we start to look at the different types of issues that families have, these are pretty much the primary ones. So we've got partner difficulty, so parents not being able to get along, parent-child conflict, um, problem or personal problems of family members, as we just kind of talked about there, the impact of social and economic forces. So what if someone's not working or is underemployed? It has an impact on how the family functions. Being a single parent is a whole different piece as well. And then being a teen parent actually has some implications and could become a source of problems for how that family operates, as well as blended families. So families coming together with step kids and biological kids. So these are all the types of conflicts, or not all of the types of conflicts, but the conflict that we see primarily in families and how they function. And then we also have to keep in mind diverse families. So, not all of us originated here in this country. And so when we think about the experience for families who have immigrated to this country, then it's even different because they come from a different place with a different culture and different customs. And now they're in the United States that has its own unique set of customs. And so issues around acculturation, in terms of how do people adjust to this new dynamic in terms of this was okay in the old country, this is not okay in this country. Those could be points of contention as well as they could be sources of problems for families, as well as school adjustment and being able to find adequate employment. So when you're looking at working again with those diverse families, it's really about having them tell you their story about where they come from and how they operate and how they work as a family if we're going to have any attempt to be successful in helping them navigate some of their issues. The other thing that we have to do when we're working with families as well is we have to use a strength-based approach. So every person, every family that you have ever worked with or will work with has some strengths. No matter how dire the situation may seem, no matter how chaotic, no matter or how difficult or seemingly hopeless, families have strengths. There are some things that they have been able to do and have done well. So it's about you as a social worker being able to help identify what those strengths and resources are. Because oftentimes when families are in despair, they don't see that there's anything that they're doing right. And so, being able to demonstrate to them what they are doing that's right. You have maintained employment for the last 15 years. You have provided for your particular family. Yes, things may not be going well now in terms of how people are getting along, but you have met your criteria in terms of your role as being a provider for your family. So it's those kind of things that people often don't pay attention to. Um, in terms of their personalities, in terms of their aptitude, in terms of how they connect with other people, all of those could be sources of strength that families need to be made aware of so that they can build on those when you're starting to put together a plan. Um, Again, that engagement, the assessment, the planning, going back to the journalist intervention model, is you want to pay attention to minimizing that early apprehension. So you show up at a family's house, they don't really have an idea about why you're there, what's going to happen, and it's nerve wracking and it could be scary. So your job is to put them at ease. Uh, Ask the family members to tell you what's wrong. So don't go in with your own assumptions about these are the things that need to be changed in this family because you'll be off base most of the time. Families need to tell you what's wrong, and then you need to take your cues from them. Establish an agreement with all the folks that are there. Pay attention to everybody, how they relate to each other. Commit to a plan of action, looking at what are some goals, what do we want to be different at the end of this, and then reinforce those strengths and those positive qualities for those particular families. So that concludes my little piece here today on understanding how to work with families. It's a very valuable piece. As you're doing some of your competency assignments, there is a systems analysis paper that you guys will be working on. And so this might be a helpful video as you think about how to answer some of the questions that relate to that particular family in that video and how they actually operate. So as always, make sure you do your readings, make sure you come to class prepared to have some healthy dialogue and to do some in-class activities to really further our learning as it relates to how to work with families. See you soon.